Good day to all of you. Lesson for today is lesson number 2, chapter 29 from the economic growth. Chapter economic growth. In the previous lesson, we discussed about the GDP, gross domestic product, methods of calculating, 3 different methods of calculating GDP, gross domestic product, which include income approach, expenditure approach, as well as the output approach. Then finally, we discuss about the conversion from nominal GDP to real GDP, as well as real GDP per head calculation. So in this lesson, we're going to discuss about recession and economic growth, causes of recession and economic growth, and policies to promote the economic growth. Let's get started. Instruction for students. Students are required to read, watch, and read Econs course book page 253 to 257 together with the attached notes given here. Watch video presentation, this video presentation uploaded in your Google Classroom. Do 4-part questions page 259. Learning objective: by end of this lesson, students should be able to define economic growth, define recession, analyze the causes of both recession and economic growth. Right, like mainly what caused recession is a decrease in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, whereas the causes of an economic growth is whenever there is an increase in the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So you can easily analyze the causes of recession as well as the economic growth by simply using the aggregate demand, the shift in the aggregate demand as well as the aggregate supply by simply using the AS framework. Whereas in defining economic growth is a positive real GDP growth. So if there is a positive real GDP growth, therefore there is an economic growth. Whereas if there is a negative real GDP growth, therefore there is a recession. A decline in the real GDP will cause recession, provided it prolongs more than 6 months, or at least 6 months and above. We can conclude that there is a recession in the economy. Whereas economic growth is as long as there's a positive growth in the real GDP. Therefore, at least of 2 quarters or 6 months or more, therefore we can conclude there is an economic growth in the economy. So next, students should be able to discuss the consequences of economic growth. What are the impacts of economic growth in the economy, the positive and the negative impacts of. Okay, so that we have a set of positive impacts and negative impacts. And finally, you should be able to discuss the effectiveness of the policies available, like fiscal policy, monetary policy, as well as the supply side policy to promote the economic growth. So mainly we are talking about the expansionary fiscal policy as well as the expansionary monetary policy together with the supply side policy, which these 3 policies will promote economic growth in the economy. So let's get started with the recession. Recession happens when a national income output or real GDP, they are almost the same, declines over a period of time, normally 6 months, half a year, or 2 successive quarters, which brings the same meaning, at least of 6 months and above. Therefore, we can conclude that there is a recession in the economy. It is a period of negative growth than the previous period. At least if you go by half a yearly or at least 2 quarters, we can conclude there is a recession in the economy. So causes of recession, there are 2 main causes. Number 1 is that if there is a decrease in the aggregate demand, as I told you, you can simply use ADAS framework to explain what are the possible causes of the recession in the economy. Whenever there is a decline in the aggregate demand, so this causing a recession, as well as whenever there is a decline in the aggregate supply also will cause recession in the economy. So let's take a look at the first case, a decrease in the aggregate demand. So a decrease in the aggregate demand probably due to a reduction in the consumption level, investment level, and government expenditure, or there is a deficit net exports in the economy. So this can lead to a decline in the aggregate demand. Therefore, the aggregate demand may shift to the left from AD0 to AD1, which will cause a drop in the general price level, which is good. However, there is also a simultaneous drop in the national output, which will cause a negative real GDP growth or a recession. So a decrease in AD from AD0 to AD1 causes the equilibrium point to change from E0 to E1, resulting a decline in the real GDP from Y0 to Y1, a recession taking place over there. So in this case, it also resulted in fall in the general price level. So the other case, the second case, a decrease in A as aggregate supply. Okay, this is possibly due to a rise in the cost of production in the entire economy, like which caused by the rise in the raw material prices, fuel prices, or due to some other resource prices. Therefore, the effect can be shown in terms of the A as aggregate supply, where the supply side, the cost push inflation, where you can see when the aggregate supply shift to the left from AS0 to AS1, the price increases from P0 to P1. At the same time, the output reduces from Y0 to Y1, which causing a recession in the economy. So impacts of recession includes lower output or economic growth in an economy. Next is what? When there is a decline in the national output or income will cause higher unemployment rate in the economy, where some of the workers will be losing their jobs as there is a decline in the real GDP in the economy. Next, as the value of real GDP drops, this will lead to a decline in the real GDP per head, which causes a lower standards of living. So the measure for the standards of living is the real GDP per head. As the value of real GDP reduces, the value for real GDP per person or real GDP per capita will reduce. So next, as people losing more jobs in the economy due to a decline in the real GDP also will cause a decline in the tax revenue. So next is economic growth, the other extreme of recession. Economic growth is a positive growth in the real GDP, whereas recession is a negative growth in the real GDP. So if you look at the economic growth is perceived as an increase in the real GDP or output. In the long run, it leads to an increase in the productive potential in the economy. So causes of economic growth is the other extreme, exactly the other extreme of the recession, where an increase in the aggregate demand and an increase in the aggregate supply. An increase in the aggregate demand is probably due to the implementation of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, as well as the supply side policies, which will cause an increase in the aggregate supply. So let's take a look at the case. So first case on the an increase in the aggregate demand, which caused the economic growth. So an increase in the aggregate demand is probably due to the expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. All right. So the implementation of expansionary fiscal and monetary policy by reducing the tax and increasing the government expenditure, as well as reducing the rate of interest and rising the money supply, may cause more aggregate demand in the economy. This will cause the AD curve to shift from AD0 to AD1. Therefore, the new equilibrium point establishes at the point E1, where new price level at P1 and new national output at Y1. So the impact of an increase in the aggregate demand causing a more inflationary pressure, at the same time higher national output, higher real GDP, and also more employment in the economy. So the other case of economic growth or other factor that causing an economic growth in the economy is by use of the supply side policies, where as the government implemented the supply side policy measures, you can see the AS tend to shift to the rightwards from AS0 to AS1, which causing a new equilibrium point established at point E1, where this reduces the inflationary pressure in the economy, where you can see the price level, the general price level drops from P0 to P1, and national output rises from Y0 to Y1. So whenever the national output rises from Y0 to Y1, it shows there are some jobs has been created in the economy, which increases the employment level in the economy as well as reduces the unemployment rate in the economy. So impacts of economic growth, there are both positive and negative impacts of economic growth. Those positive impacts include of more goods and services produced. If there is an economic growth in the country, it means there are more goods and services produced in the economy. Therefore, consumers can enjoy more wider choices of goods and services, or more goods and services at a cheaper price level in the economy. At the same time, improvement in the living standard as the per capita income increases due to the higher economic growth. Fall in the unemployment rate because of creation of jobs in the economy. As the country able to produce more outputs, more goods and services, therefore more tax revenue collected by the government, which leads to allocation of government expenditure for merit goods such as the healthcare and education, and this will decline the level of poverty in the economy. So these are the positive impacts of economic growth. Whereas if you look at the negative impact of the economic growth, firstly is the depletion of non-renewable resources in the economy, damage to the natural environment and destruction of wildlife habitats. Right. Next will be the long hours of work and greater stress to workers. And economic growth also results in an upward pressure of prices, or inflationary effect in the economy. So policies to promote economic growth include fiscal policy, monetary policy, as well as the supply side policy, specifically the expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. And expansionary fiscal policy is by a tax cut to encourage consumption and investment, and raises the aggregate demand in the economy, which causing economic growth in the economy. An increase in the government expenditure also raises the aggregate demand as well as the GDP in the economic growth in the economy. So next, monetary policy, a cut in the rate of interest as well as a direct increase in the money supply also will raise the aggregate demand and encourage economic growth in the country. So if you look at the supply side policies, will adjust or will boost the aggregate supply, will lead to AS to shift to the right. So through the improvement in the education and training, increase in the quantity and the quality of economic resources by improving the education, improving the quality and the quantity of education and training, tax cuts and incentives to work, deregulation and labor reformation in order to increase the aggregate supply in the economy, privatization and subsidies. All this will lead to an increase in the aggregate supply, will promote economic growth in an economy. Right. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.